Common Core standards unless they have an affirmative vote of the legislature. So we've been tasked with arriving at some sort of recommendation for that decision. Let me first read a letter dated June 20th from Michigan House, or from Speaker Jace Bolger. Dear Mr. Clerk, with the concurrence of Chair Lyons, I hereby create the House Education Subcommittee on Common Core Standards and appoint the following members: Representative Kelly as Chair, Rep. Amanda Price Vice Chair, Rep. Pagel, Rep. McMillan, Rep. O'Brien, Rogers, Yonker, Verheulen, Singh as Majority Vice Chair, Representative Shore, Gniezik, Lipton, and Zemke. We're going to have two speakers today. The first will be Michael Cohen, President of Achieve Incorporated, and the second will be Mike Flanagan, Michigan State Superintendent. By way of introduction of Mr. Cohen, in a previous lifetime, I was Governor John Engler's Education Policy Advisor from 95 to 99. And part of that was serving on the State Board of Education and also any national boards that he sat on, one being at the beginning of Achieve Incorporated. Also familiar at the time with the National Goals 2000, as well as sat on the National Assessment Governing Board that oversees the NAEP test, National Assessment of Education Progress. So I've came to know Mr. Cohen back when he was not only an advisor to President Clinton. I might remind the crowd that President Clinton spoke here to the joint session of the Michigan legislature regarding national standards and national testing. At the time, that was in 1997, I believe. Michael Cohen, in his adult career, has worked for the National Association of School Boards, the U.S. Department of Education under Secretary Riley, served in the White House under President Bill Clinton, and is now currently the president of Achieve. And Mr. Cohen will tell us not only more about Achieve, but what their work is involved with Common Core. And with that, Mr. Cohen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, members of the committee, for inviting me to speak with you this morning. I think you've got a very important job, which is to advise the legislature on whether to move forward with the implementation of the Common Core. That's a very serious issue. And I know there are a variety of views and concerns about that. What I've been asked to do today is tell the story, if you will, of how we got here, right? Where did the Common Core come from? What preceded it? How did we get here? So that's largely what I'm going to speak to this morning. I want to start first. I want to, first of all, note that with regard to the Common Core, there are 45 states and the District of Columbia and the Department of Defense education activity that have adopted the standards. If you think about it, that is a rather remarkable, if not improbable, development to get 45 states to do anything together, and particularly to do it without federal involvement at all. But it's not the result of somebody who could command the states to do this. It's not the result of a conspiracy to get states to do it. It's the result of choices that state leaders in each of the participating states made, given the history of what preceded this, right? What their own state standards were like, what the strengths and weaknesses of them were about. So that's the main story that I want to tell you. I want to say a word or two about Achieve first, partly because the chairman asked me to, and I'm taking off my watch so I can pay some attention to how long I'm speaking, because I want to make sure there is time for lots of questions and discussion. The other reason for talking about Achieve is because we've played a critical role in the standards-based reform effort at times here in Michigan and in most other states. So our work has been integrally involved in the evolution that has occurred from the beginning of the state standards movement to where things stand today. We are an independent, bipartisan, nonprofit education reform organization. Our focus is entirely on helping states set standards, set expectations for students, improve their assessments and accountability, all towards the end of making sure that students complete high school prepared for post-secondary success. And when we talk about post-secondary success, we're guided by the view that everybody ought to leave high school prepared for careers, the career of their choice. In many cases, right now, students, regardless of their specific career choice, are most likely to require some post-secondary education. Roughly 2/3 of the jobs going forward that pay well, have advancement potential, will require education beyond high school. But not everyone needs to go to a 4-year college to get that education or training. Career and technical training programs that lead to industry-recognized credentials, 2-year institutions as well as 4-year institutions all have a role to play. In our view, the responsibility of the K-12 system is to ensure that the students who graduate from high school have the core academic skills that they need to pursue whatever career they choose through whatever education pathway is necessary to get there. So our work has been entirely focused on the set of issues and expectations required to prepare students for post-secondary success. We were founded in 1996 at a National Education Summit organized by governors and business leaders and educators who recognize the important role that standards play in guiding the K-12 system, and understood that those standards, which were that movement was just getting underway, would need continuous support and improvement in order to move the education system where it needed to go. Achieve was founded at that summit, and its board has been comprised of state governors and business leaders. Governor Engler, as Representative Kelly pointed out, was one of our founding members of our board of directors. Since we were founded, we have worked with upwards of 40 states in one way or another to help them review and improve the quality of their standards, to strengthen the assessments that they provide, and the like. The signature project that we've had is called the American Diploma Project, which pushed states to align their expectations for high school graduation with the knowledge and skill demands that students would need to succeed afterwards. We played an important role in supporting the development of the Common Core Standards, working with the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers. And currently we serve as the project management partner for one of the two multi-state assessment consortia. In this case, PARC. Michigan is part of the Smarter Balanced one, but we basically help 20 states work together to develop a set of assessments aligned to the Common Core. So that's just a brief overview of what we have done. I want to go back briefly to actually A Nation at Risk, because that's really when the idea of raising standards began to take hold in American education. If you remember, A Nation at Risk was a report commissioned by the Reagan administration, and it identified low expectations as one of the primary causes of the mediocre performance of U.S. students compared to those in other countries. That report was quickly followed in 1985 by a report called Time for Results from the National Governors Association under the leadership of then Governor, now Senator Lamar Alexander, in which governors committed to set high expectations for students in each of their states and to hold schools accountable for producing results against those expectations rather than holding schools accountable for complying with input regulations and requirements. This in turn was followed by an education summit that the first President Bush convened in 1989 with 48, I think, or 49 of the nation's governors. Together they established national education goals and called on states to set academic standards. So that's where the idea of academic standards begin to take hold among state education leaders. Now, in talking about state standards going back to this period of time, I want to point out that there's an interesting and probably not well understood relationship between states and the federal government in this space of standards. So every state now has its own state standards, or at least up until adoption of the Common Core, there were 50 different sets of state standards, each developed by the state on its own. The funding for the development of state standards was actually provided by the federal government, starting in 1990 when Secretary of Alexander awarded grants to each of the states to develop their own standards. It was followed by the enactment of Goals 2000 and the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, both of which required states to have their own standards and tests, and provided the funds to pay for those. No Child Left Behind continued the requirement that states adopt their own standards and tests, and again provided the funds to support their development and implementation. So the federal government has been a partner in state-led standards, state-by-state standards, since the beginning. Second thing I want to point out is that there have been various efforts to create national standards, again, starting with the Bush administration, which proposed 15 American Achievement Exams, voluntary national tests, and which funded a variety of national organizations to develop model standards that the states could use if they wanted to in all of the core academic subjects. The Clinton administration proposed a mechanism to evaluate and review those standards, and it also proposed voluntary national tests. To make a long story short, none of those federal efforts worked. They all crashed and burned in one way or another. What endures, right, is the state-by-state standards, again, required by and paid for by the federal government. So that's sort of briefly how we got, at least how we came to have 50 state standards. The standards, by the way, it's important to point out what academic standards do in every state is define the goals and outcomes of instruction. It's the desired, it's what we desire, the knowledge and skills that we desire students to acquire along the way. What they are not is a curriculum. They are not a set of instructional methods. They are not a set of instructional materials. Depending upon the state, those are either developed separately by the state or in most cases left to local school boards and individual teachers to decide on their own. So the standards are defining the outcomes. The curriculum and the like basically is how one gets there. And oftentimes those decisions are made at the local level, have always been, and I believe will and should continue to be made at the local level. So when this all started in the early 1990s, there were about a dozen states that had developed standards. By 2000, 2001, all 50 states had standards, and many states had reviewed and revised their standards at least once. And in most cases, when they revised their standards, they improved them. They made them more rigorous. They made them more clear. They made them more manageable for teachers to use in the classroom. They were developed by committees of content experts in each state who had to reach agreement on what would be in the standards. One of the downsides of that approach, one of the upsides was it got agreement. One of the downsides is oftentimes the mechanism of getting agreement was probably not dramatically different from the way you often get agreement on bills, which is you include things that someone else needs to be in there in order to get their support, while you make sure that what you need to have in there secures your support. That was often the process of developing academic standards. The result was that, among other things, they weren't coherent, and they often had a lot of stuff in them that would be hard for a teacher to teach in any year. But that tended to get better as states learned more and began to revise them. But notwithstanding improvements that were made over the 1990s and into the last decade, many standards in many states continued to suffer from some significant weaknesses. One of those was that in virtually no state were the standards intentionally aligned with the skills needed for post-secondary success. To put it slightly differently, if you get a group of math experts together and decide what they think would be desirable for students to learn about mathematics and reach an agreement on that, that is not the same as asking the question, what is essential for students to know in order to succeed after they complete high school? If they're going to a technical training program, what math skills will they need? If they're going to be in a 2- and 4-year college, what math skills will they need in order to be placed into credit-bearing rather than remedial courses? That's important, right, to do, because right now, nationally, about 30% of the first-year students in 2- and 4-year colleges and technical training programs, about 30% of them are required to take remedial courses to make up for skills that they lack when they completed high school. For those students, right, the sorry state of affairs is that they pay college tuition. They do not earn college credit for those courses, and the odds that they will earn some kind of degree or certificate are about half of those of their better prepared students. So that's not a good deal for anybody, but that's what happens when students are not well prepared. So in any event, states did not go through that kind of exercise to intentionally align their K-12 standards with demands of the workplace or the post-secondary training programs that students would be going into. In addition to that leading to high remediation rates, we know from other data, Achieve did a series of surveys of recent high school graduates back in 2004. We found half of them were in the workplace and half of them were in college, and regardless of where they were, about 40 to 45% of them reported that they now realize they lack the academic skills they need to succeed in wherever they are. We surveyed faculty who taught first-year students, and they estimated slightly more than 40% of the students they're teaching in the credit-bearing courses, not in the remedial courses. About 45% of them really lack the skills they needed to succeed in first-year courses. We surveyed employers who hired young people out of high school who basically told us that, again, about 40 to 45% of them may be okay for the entry-level job that they're in, but they lack the skills to advance. So you put all that together and you see a picture of a significant number of students who graduate from high school each year and who are poorly prepared. And one cause of that is that in most states they didn't define what students needed to know and be able to do in order to succeed when they put the standards together, which led to the curriculum. So again, one major weakness in state standards was their lack of alignment to the demands that students will face. Secondly, literally and figuratively, state standards were all over the map. And I mean several things by that. A study a number of years ago of K-8 mathematics standards in the states found that as little as 20% of standards in any grade was shared across states, right? So each state was teaching fractions at a different point in the grade structure, for example, or we're teaching addition and subtraction with carrying at different points. Yet mathematics is the most logical, structured discipline there is. You need to learn some things before you learn other things. So the lack of consistency across states was not a problem because consistency is important in and of its own right, but because it's hard to imagine how an effective curriculum could be built off standards that were that disparate. Another way to look at this is based on work that Bill Schmidt here at Michigan State has done, looking at high-performing countries in mathematics. And you've probably heard him say this already, but his characterization of mathematics standards in the states, and therefore the curricula that were developed based on that, is that they're a mile wide and an inch deep. There might be 40 topics in mathematics that a teacher has to cover each year, which is probably 30 more than is reasonable. The result of that is that teachers breeze through the topics pretty quickly, don't have an opportunity to teach them in very great depth. They're much more the treatment is much more superficial. Consequently, for most students, their understanding of what they've been taught is quite limited. Their ability, they might learn an algorithm or a formula, but they're not likely to understand the mathematics underlying it or know when and why to apply it. Then next year, in most states, in most schools, students review what they didn't quite learn the previous year. The result is, again, low performance of U.S. students compared to students in other countries, and a large number of students who get to middle school who are not prepared to really learn and understand algebra and then take whatever advanced mathematics beyond that that would be necessary. If you look at how high-performing countries such as Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, Finland, and others, their standards right, are much more highly focused. They have many fewer topics. Teachers have an opportunity to teach it more slowly. Students have an opportunity to learn it in a much greater depth and then apply what they've learned, build a solid foundation, and the next year move on to the next material that they need to learn. I won't go into the same level of detail, but state reading characteristics, state reading standards also had similar shortcomings. They didn't build the ability of students to read progressively more difficult texts as they move from year to year and from grade to grade. They didn't demand that they be able to do more challenging things in order to understand the standards, the text. So it's one thing to be able to identify the main idea. It's another thing to be able to point to the evidence that justifies what you've the main idea that you've inferred. It's one thing to be able to describe the position or point of view of an author. It's another thing to be able to contrast the point of view of several authors from several different texts. But the reading standards didn't build in that increasing complexity that continues to challenge kids and deepen their skills. So again, the math and reading standards were all over the map and were not organized in a clear and logical manner. Second major problem, or third major problem with state standards is really with state tests and proficiency standards, the scores you need to reach in order to be considered proficient. And the short version of this, first of all, is they are all over the map as well. Proficient in Michigan does not mean the same thing as proficient in Minnesota or proficient in Massachusetts. And we know that because you can compare the performance on individual state tests, the results from individual state tests, with how each state does on the National Assessment of Education Progress, a national assessment given to a sample of students in each state. We know from for example, the 2009 administration that in 35 states, including, unfortunately, Michigan, the scores that earn a proficient determination on the state fourth grade reading test would be considered below basic on the fourth grade National Assessment of Education Progress. In Massachusetts, which is the highest performing state, just over half, 54% of fourth graders scored proficient on the state reading test. About 47% of students in fourth graders in Massachusetts scored proficient on the national assessment. So 54%, 47%, not much difference there, right? There's a degree of rigor in the Massachusetts test. In contrast, in Michigan, in the 2009 test, 77% of fourth graders scored proficient on the state reading test, while only 30% scored proficient on the National Assessment of Education Progress. So in Michigan, students are being told they're proficient, right, at far different rates than students in Massachusetts, even though the students in Massachusetts are outperforming students in Michigan on the same highly regarded assessment. State high school tests are not as rigorous as one would imagine that they are. A number of years ago, first of all, about half the states in the country require students to pass an exit exam in order to earn a high school diploma. About 6 or 7 years ago, Achieve did a study looking in detail at those tests in 5 different states, in Texas, Florida, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Ohio. These are tests that are given in the 10th grade. And what we found was that when you look at the items that are on the test and the questions that students need to get correct in order to pass, that in order to pass these math tests, students basically needed to demonstrate knowledge that students in high-performing countries around the world typically teach in 8th grade. So these are tests that U.S. students are taking in 10th grade. They actually measure what students around the world learn in 8th grade, but students are told that they can graduate at 12th grade based on the results of those tests. So there's a big gap between what the tests measure and what students actually need to know to succeed. Clearly, in many states, students are told that they're proficient when they're not really prepared for what comes next. So this is important for a number of reasons. First of all, these tests are used to hold schools accountable. Right? The tests are the tools that you use and parents use and the public use to understand whether the schools in the state are making progress and whether the tax dollars that you spend are actually producing the results that you need. But if all you have to look at is a state-specific test, right, with unknown relationship to either real-world skills or to how students in other states perform, you don't have a very good guide to judge either the level of performance in the state or the rate of progress that the state is making. You don't really know just how well your dollars are being used. I think that's a problem. It's at least a limitation in the current system. So identified three pretty big weaknesses with the current state standards and tests. They're not well aligned to the real-world demand students will meet. They are literally all over the map and weak in quality in a variety of ways, and that's as true of the tests as it is for the states. Evidence about these weaknesses became increasingly apparent to governors, to chief state school officers, to other state education policymakers, to educators in the public over the last 5 or 10 years or so. Every time the National Assessment of Education Progress released its results, people in the state at least had a day to wonder, why are so many kids in the state proficient on the state test but not on some other national measure? Why are so many students required to take remedial courses after we hand them a high school diploma? This became an increasingly untenable situation for states to face, and it needed some solution, some resolution. They also concluded, governors and chiefs in particular, that addressing those common problems, common weaknesses, one state at a time, 50 times over, would not be a particularly effective, right, or efficient way to address them. In 2008, the National Governors Association, the Chief State School Officers, and Achieve formed an advisory group, and one of the recommendations that they made was that states ought to benchmark or to work together to benchmark their standards against those in high-performing countries to make sure that they were aiming in an internationally high and an internationally competitive environment, and that the logical result of that international benchmarking ought to be a common set of standards among states. In the same year, Achieve did a study of about 18 states that had worked to align their high school standards with the skills needed to succeed in post-secondary education and the workplace, and found that as states looked at that evidence and changed their standards accordingly, what had been quite diverse standards from state to states all of a sudden now had literally a common core of expectations. Because when you ask the question, what's the evidence about what students need to know in order to succeed after they leave high school, by and large, the answer to that question doesn't vary from state to state. We're in a global economy. States are competing with each other, but also competing with other countries. That all forces, right, a need to respond to common real-world demands. Consequently, in 2009, the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers began planning for a state-led effort to develop common standards. The fact that states had already been arriving at common standards on their own, working with each other without federal involvement, demonstrated the ability of states, if they worked intentionally, to create common standards. NGA and CCSSO launched this effort in the spring of 2009, launched it officially with the participation of, I think, 48 states, with the commitment of the governor and the chief state school officer in each state to participate in a participatory common process to develop a set of standards. They did not commit to adopt the standards because they thought it would be a good idea for the appropriate body in each state that had the authority to set standards. They thought that those bodies ought to be given an opportunity to see the standards before they committed to adopting them. So the initial commitment was to work together to develop standards, which they all hoped they would adopt, but the real question was, what would they look like? And would they be rigorous and compelling enough? There was a set of guidelines that the states committed to when they worked together to develop the standards. Again, they wanted to make sure that the standards were internationally benchmarked, that they incorporated the knowledge and skills students need for post-secondary success, that they were clear, they were focused, they were manageable in the classroom. They built on the best of existing state standards and would go one step better. than that. This was a highly participatory process. Content experts in every state had numerous opportunities to contribute language to the standards, to be part of the writing process, and to be part of the review process. There were three public reviews of standards, and they were made widely available, each one of which generated thousands and thousands of comments that were reviewed carefully and had an impact on the next draft. The states had many additional opportunities to review and comment on the standards, as did a whole bunch of national organizations, from those representing higher education, career and technical education, the teachers' unions, the local school boards, et cetera, et cetera. There was lots of opportunity for participation and lots of visits to states and districts and schools to get people directly engaged in the process. By the summer of or June of 2010, the standards were completed, were released, and since then, again, 45 states plus D.C. and the Department of Defense schools have adopted them. I want to say just one point about the standards themselves, and I know there is a lot of concern about. This speaks to the issue of the privacy of student data, which I think is a legitimate concern every place. The Common Core standards don't require anybody to collect any data on any student. I think the only place the word data is mentioned is in the math standards, along with words about probability and statistics, things that students ought to learn about in data analysis. But there's nothing in the standards that calls for, asks for, suggests that any data be collected. These simply describe the kind of outcomes that we expect from instruction. In closing, though, let me point out just a couple of advances that these standards make, and then I will stop and we'll happily take your questions. In mathematics, these standards are an advance over current state standards in a number of ways. First, they are aligned with the real-world demands students will meet. They bring a much sharper focus, right, to what students are expected to learn in each grade, getting away from the mile-wide and inch-deep phenomena. There is a clear, logical progression from grade to grade to grade. And these are rigorous standards. Students are expected, number one, to be fluent in the algorithms and procedures. They should know the multiplication tables. They should know the formulas that they're supposed to use for, finding the angle of a triangle. They need to know those things cold. Secondly, they need to understand the mathematical concepts behind that, so they understand what they're doing. And thirdly and importantly, they need to be able to take what they've learned and apply it to new situations. Can they use what they've learned, right, outside of the specific context in which they've learned it? In English language arts and literacy, there are also some pretty significant advances, because the reading that students will be expected to do when they complete high school, whether they're in a college classroom or a technical training program or in the workplace, right, requires them to read what the experts call informational texts. That is not literature, but nonfiction, whether it's the founding documents, which are called for in the standards, or technical training manuals, or science or history textbooks. Right? There's a tremendous emphasis in the Common Core standards in teaching students how to read those kinds of texts, in addition to maintaining a strong emphasis on teaching and learning literature. The second major advance here is that there's a tremendous emphasis on teaching students how to draw evidence from what they read, right, and use it to make a coherent, logical argument, right, typically in writing, but it also could be through a video or a PowerPoint presentation or something like that. But the point is that when students are reading, they're reading for information. They need to find the relevant information and be able to make an argument or take a position based on what they have learned from what they've read, and they need to be able to do that from multiple sources of evidence, not just one. And they need to be able to read texts of increasing complexity. That is, the ideas need to be complex. You need to work a little bit harder to understand the text. Not everything is spelled out clearly. Sometimes you've got to read something several times and struggle with a bit in order to understand it. But that's what real-world reading is often like. And so students get that kind of preparation if their teachers are following the Common Core standards. So with that, I think I will stop. I've tried to give you mostly an overview of how we got to where we are and a brief statement of what's significant about where things stand. But I think what's most important is to respond to the questions and concerns that each of you have. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. Representative Shore.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a whole variety of questions, but I'll try and keep it narrow.
I'll try to keep my answers brief.
I had two questions. One of my questions concerns not just about the Common Core, but about the curriculum in general is how you balance different socioeconomic areas. You've got some that have different pressures on the students because of where they live. Now, you'd mentioned the different countries and other things, and how there's 8th grade standard there as our 10th grade, and I'm sure they have the same impacts within their country. So how does first I want to know how the Common Core addresses that and how we balance that. And the second question I have is, I don't know if you said this anywhere in your comments, is how does the Common Core bring in the parents and their ability to assist their students? One of the issues that I have faced as a parent, and that has been brought to my attention, is that the Common Core has several different ways of attacking a problem. And I mean, my son brought home something, a lattice problem, and I know how to, do a lot of different math, and I didn't know that, and I wasn't able to help him as a parent. And I was told that they have to answer things 4 different ways and get it right all 4 ways and show their work, and it's a different kind of model than we learned. So how do you bring in parental involvement?
Okay, let me answer the first question first, and then the parental question. So I think the fundamental question you asked is, given the different backgrounds of kids, given the existence of poverty and other family conditions, students arrive at school with different levels of preparation. How do the Common Core standards deal with that? The answer is they deal with that in 2 ways. One is holding all students to the same expectations, and the reason they do that is because in the real world, students will be held to the same expectations. When you all have to do your work, whether it's in the legislature or in whatever other career you might be in, no one asks where you came from, right? And whether you're really prepared to do something as challenging as the workplace requires. Either you can do it or you can't, right? That's sort of the world in which we live. So that notion that we need to expect the same level of performance from all students and educate them to that is pervasive in the Common Core. But the second thing is that because the standards in mathematics is a good example, because there are fewer topics, because there is more time to teach them in depth, because that allows the teacher to figure out gives the teacher time to figure out where a student is, right, whether it's in mathematics or in learning to read, right, identify their needs and begin to build the scaffolding and supports to get them from where they currently are to where they need to be. So it's, in effect, the gift of time that the standards provide, as well as the ability to create assessments and other instructional tools that can help teachers. But it's that gift of time that allows teachers to be able to work with students where they are and bring them up there to where they need to be, is the fundamental way that's addressed. That issue is addressed. With regard to parent involvement, couple things. In general, the standards are not designed with parent involvement in mind, nor with limiting parent involvement. Again, they are simply statements of what it is students need to know and be able to do, right, as they progress through school and complete education. So it's really the school's job, right, to keep the parents informed about what they expect their students to do. By the way, I think it's been the school's job to do that long before the Common Core. I have a 30-year-old and a 23-year-old. They're well past Common Core, but in our schools, right, teachers sat down with the parents and explained what the curriculum was for the year, what the expectations were for the year, and were available to help us figure out how we could help our students. I will tell you, I can't remember what grade level, but there was certainly a point with both of my kids that they needed someone other than me to help them with their math homework, and that was before Common Core. So students are going to need extra help. Their parents will be able to help them to some extent, but as the work in any subject gets more complex, it may well be beyond the ability of parents to do the explaining and the instructing. That's the teacher's job and the school's job.
Thank you. Representative Price.
Hey, Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just have a couple questions. Frequently, Common Core talks about the international benchmarking. So I'm wondering if you could do a little bit more of a deep dive in that, talk about what countries were benchmarked, how was that benchmarking conducted, and then I have a second question on that, or not on that, but another phrase I hear about Common Core, mile wide, inch deep. I hear that frequently from teachers, administrators, everyone. And can you give us a more detailed breakdown of what that means in terms of a curriculum for kids?
I can begin to answer that question. I will tell you that the best source of an answer for this is right here in Michigan. It's Bill Schmidt at Michigan State. So first of all, when it came to international benchmarking, I'm going to focus on mathematics now. There is a test that has been called the international TIMSS, the Third International Measure of Math and Science, that's been given 3 times now over the last decade or so. And you're able to compare the results of U.S. students, the performance of U.S. students, with those in other countries. So the high-performing countries, this always varies a little bit at grade level and by, at which test you're talking about, but Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Finland are among the consistently high-performing countries. And what the TIMSS data enable you to do, right, is not only see who's the high performers, but they gathered additional data to look at what the curriculum in each country was like. And what is most striking about the difference between those countries and the U.S., and Professor Schmidt has got this laid out for almost all of the 50 states, right, is that in those high-performing countries, particularly in the elementary grades, there is a very small number of topics that are taught. So there might be, say, in 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade, a lot of attention paid to addition and subtraction and multiplication and division of rational numbers. And there won't be more than a handful of other topics taught at those grades. And you go from the 2nd to the 3rd to the 4th, the work gets a little bit more advanced and builds on the what's been taught in the previous grade. In contrast, and you could see this visually, in contrast, you just count up the number of topics, right? In U.S. standards, there might be, 4 or 5 times as many topics at any given grade level, and you see the same topics appear grade after grade after grade after grade. So that's a signal that what's happening is, again, a fairly superficial treatment of the content in each topic because there's not much time to spend on it, and then the next year another fairly superficial treatment of the topic. And the difference there, right, between what these high-performing countries do and what the U.S. does is they have time to build a solid foundation in mathematics for a far larger proportion of their students than we do in the U.S.
Thank you, Representative McMillan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'd like to ask, when the standards were being developed, you said that they were, well, who developed them? I mean, who developed the standards?
They were developed by people from the participating states. There were content experts and some outside experts, right, who worked together to.
So there were decisions that said, let's put this in, let's not put that in.
Yeah.
Are those decisions in minutes that we can get?
No. They are in the day-to-day work of groups of people communicating with each other, asking questions, and going out for feedback and input and getting it back.
So we can't find out what was accepted, who won, who lost. We won't be able to know that.
No, you probably don't know that about the Michigan standards either.
Well, but I'm being told that these are state-led, so I just want to make sure I understand. So we don't have any minutes. Do we know how it was funded, how the development of Common Core was funded?
Yes, there are a number of foundations, primarily the Gates Foundation, that funded that work. Through the Governors Association, through the Chief State School Officers, Achieve got funding from the Gates Foundation and others as well. Okay.
And then there were committees set up, like validation committees.
Right.
And as I understand it, some of the experts were criticizing, saying this isn't good, this is poor. Are there minutes available for that?
I'm not sure. We can check.
All right. Dr. Stotsky says there never was, and there never was an opportunity to approve minutes or actually say what was actually going on in these committees.
That could be. I wasn't always involved in those meetings. Dr. Stotsky left an extensive record of her comments throughout the process.
Right. So I guess as far as it being state-led, we don't know. We don't actually know the decisions and how they were being made or arrived at. I mean, I don't know if Michigan's input was actually accepted or not accepted. We don't know.
Not input by input, but let me respond in a slightly different way. Right, state-led means the states collectively led this effort. No single state led it. And when there were drafts that were, first of all, when the standards were being written, there were content experts from as many states as were interested, right, involved in email discussions and conference calls and a variety of ways of getting input. So there were as many states as content experts, as many states that were interested were involved in those. There are thousands of decisions that get made in developing a set of standards, including editorial decisions of whether it's this word or that word. That
I'll move off of this, but just can you explain? David Coleman explained to the Strategic Data Project that he had to sell the Common Core to states and governors. Mm-hmm. What did he mean by? I mean, that sounds to me like it wasn't really state-led. He developed them with a few other folks and then sold it to the government. His words are very clear that he had to sell it and that it wasn't an easy thing. What did he mean by that?
Well, you should probably ask him that. I've worked closely with him, and there are surely times when he or someone else was trying to explain the benefits and advantages of Common Core. But again, it was the states, right, that decided they needed to work together on this. It was the governors and chief state school officers. It was their national organizations that organized the process. So David was one of the people involved in the writing. He was selected by those organizations, and he could be let go by those organizations anytime they or their members found that that this wasn't acceptable to them.
Representative, we have some other.
I just wanted to get. This is. I think this is important. Internationally benchmarked. Do we get the crosswalks? Do we understand? I mean, I hear that there. Can I get those?
Sure.
What countries? So we'll have countries and the specific crosswalks for every item in the Common Core?
Every item, no.
Well, I would hope so. I mean, we're talking about 46 states, and this is the big claims.
Representative, he mentioned earlier the countries that have been benchmarked.
No, but I mean, we need to know, because we have experts that say that they're not internationally benchmarked. Well, and then there are experts that say there are, so we need to see the backup so that we can make those decisions ourselves.
We can provide you the backup that was used to develop the standards.
Okay.
We have other questions. Representative Lipton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have some questions in terms of the financials. Are you aware, or do you know, or are you aware of a company, Pearson?
Who?
Pearson.
Yes, they're a major global company that does testing and textbook publishing.
Are you aware, or do you know of their involvement in the Smarter Balanced assessment?
No, I'm not aware of their involvement in Smarter Balance, but it wouldn't surprise me if they were involved in some way.
They, in a 2012 report to their investors, I quote that Pearson 2012 was a terrific year. We launched the online assessment readiness tool and the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium, Common Core Consortia, to help 45 states prepare for the transition to online assessments. And they talk about the new state contracts that they won. So a report to their investors. So it appears through this that Pearson is lauding to their investors their involvement and investment in the Smarter Balanced Consortium.
So one of the things that they refer to there is this transition to online assessment. So both Smarter Balance and the PARC Consortia, which I'm involved in, right, are developing tests that could be administered online. And one of the things that they and leaders in each of the states needed to know was how ready are the schools to administer tests online? And Smarter Balanced and Park pooled our resources and issued an RFP, a competitive procurement, for someone to create a tool that could analyze the technology infrastructure within each state. Pearson won that contract competitively, and I suspect that's what they boasted to their investors about.
Yeah, it certainly appears so. They seem to be very happy about that, and
I guess,
presumably their
frankly,
investors
Pearson
are
is
too.
a
Yes,
global
thank you.
company. I think the value of that contract is pretty small for them.
Yes, thank you. Are you familiar with the National Education Policy Center
So, I'm not sure who that is.
out of the University of Colorado at Boulder
I'm aware of them.
School of Education? And are you aware of an analysis in October 2010 that they made on the blueprint for reform, which of course was the administration's sort of launching in March 2010?
I know the blueprint. I assume they did an analysis.
They did analysis, but you're not familiar with the analysis?
Not in the details, no.
Okay. I won't read the whole thing, but one of the things that NEPC criticized is the over-reliance on standardized test scores. And they actually criticized the entire blueprint in terms of, I'll just read the topic headings. The research summaries are of inadequate quality. There are vital omissions in the 6 research summaries. An accountability system is missing. Intervention models are without data. Competitive grants not addressed. But they talk about the over-reliance on standardized test scores. I quote, "Throughout the research summaries, test scores are the ubiquitous measure of schooling quality and success. While test scores are of some value, they cannot measure the broader purposes of schools, either academically or as key institutions in a democratic society. The administration has given lip service to the need for more comprehensive evaluation measures, but these summaries offer little or nothing beyond test-based evaluation." And there's been a lot of concerns, academic concerns, about the over-reliance on test scores. And you did talk about the integration of the accountability and test to
Right.
the Common Core. That's not a concern.
Well,
apparently.
let me separate out a couple of issues here. I mean, states have relied on testing for accountability, again, for about 20 years now. My personal belief is that always needs to be part of an accountability system, but it shouldn't be the only indicator that are used. And I think we need better tests going forward than we have now. That's one of the things that both of the two consortia are trying to create. But it's better tests. But stepping back from that, I want to make a distinction between the Common Core state standards that the states work together to develop and a policy proposal from the Obama administration. They're not the same, and I suspect if you lined up the leaders from the 50 or 45 states that have adopted the Common Core, they might have 45 views about the administration's proposal, and a lot of them won't be supportive of it.
So you could see a splitting off of any type of an assessment that would go along with the Common Core. You see them being able to be separated?
No, I think that states need to have standards, and they need to have assessments that are among the indicators used in accountability systems. And I think states will need that, whether they have Common Core standards and assessments from one of the assessment consortia, or whether they continue to use their own standards and tests. So what I see as separable is the issue of what the standards are from the Common Core or something else. I see that separable from the question of what is the state blueprint for education improvement, and to what extent does it rely on standards and tests.
So they could, in fact, be separated off from a particular specific test that would be sold to states by a particular entity.
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I think
you answered it.
but I think the answer is yes.
Representative, we have some
One
other
final
questions.
question. I quote from a comment by a group of academics, Pennington, Obenshine, Popola, and Comita. and they commented again on this notion of the Common Core and the assessments that might be included with it. And I quote, "Ultimately, we call for a refraining of the Common Core state standards from Redeemer to Rainmaker. Rainmakers are defined by their ability to generate business by using political associations. The need to implement and assess the established Common Core state standards situates those who created the standards as rainmakers for educational publishing companies and educational consulting nonprofits they are affiliated with. Therefore, we raise the following questions, which I'll pose to you, although no answer is certainly necessary. Number one, is education destined to be guided by the testing of national standards created by a small group who profits from the tests they are paid to create? Number two, what does that mean for historical notions of public education for all within local decision-making rights? And three, are the Common Core state standards the national beginnings of the corporatization of education? Okay. And again, certainly no answer is needed, but certainly they bring up some interesting questions that I hope you and all of us will reflect upon. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I think on this, may I just make one brief answer? So I think the question makes a presumption which I would say may or may not be true. I simply don't know. But I think behind your question is the assumption that there's a windfall for testing companies in this work. Okay, the question seems to assume that, and I don't know if that's the answer. And the reason I don't know if that's the answer is because I think what may well happen is that instead of 50 different tests for 50 different states, there will be a much smaller number of tests as states. Right now we're working in two consortia. There's still a handful of states that are working independently, but the number of tests to be sold, right, and developed may be smaller as a result of the Common Core rather than larger. In contrast, by the way, the number of providers of curriculum may actually increase. As the marketplace gets bigger, you can imagine small providers having a greater opportunity to develop products that they can sell on a larger scale. I'm not positive that either of the things I said is true. I just think it's a pretty complex marketplace right now.
It is complex, and you may be interested in knowing that anything that has been put out has been copyrighted by the NGA. And as an intellectual property attorney, I'm very well aware of the reasons behind actually copyrighting those types of
Thanks. Thank you. Representative O'Brien, by the way, we have four more questions before we get to the next speaker, so if we could wrap this up as quickly as possible. Representative O'Brien.
Thank you, Chairman. In the interest of time, if I could just pose some questions or some comments that I think the committee's going to need as we go forward. One is just knowing how they did the test, if we're doing international benchmarking, what sample of students, because we have seen throughout the United States that we have some states like Michigan that test all students, while other states only test those who are college bound. So I think that's going to be something really important to know if we're comparing to international measures. We need to know the sample of the students. I guess I'd like to follow up on a few questions other people have asked. You talked about how this is going to support careers, and if you could speak specifically with vocational education, because we do have an issue right now where there are some there are standards in Michigan that often hinder those who are pursuing a vocational field.
I'm not sure I understand what that means.
Sometimes we're putting kids with our requirements of certain years of math or English. We're forcing kids to take classes that are not going to have a direct application to the field that they wish to choose. I took calculus in high school. I've yet to use it in any of my field. And so, granted, I went to a four-year university, but I think often we're forcing our students to take classes that have no real application, which thus I would argue leads probably to boredom.
So I understand there's been a rather lively debate in Michigan about the merit curriculum and what ought and ought not be required. I'm not going to try to ignite that debate here. I think you've all had lots of opportunities to discuss that. I do think that the thing to do is to make sure that we focus on again, the Common Core is focused on literacy and mathematics because those are the tools for learning lots of other subjects. You want to make sure that the most essential standards have been identified in that they can be taught through a lot of different approaches. Both mathematics and literacy can be built into career and technical education programs. We've worked with a number of states to help them think about how to integrate the Common Core into CTE programs so that kids learn it in an applied way. So I think we need to be really flexible in how those standards can be incorporated into the curriculum, which is one of the nice things about preserving local control of curriculum. There's a longer discussion to be had about this. I'd be happy to have it offline with you if that would be of interest.
Now, you talked about the data isn't going to be collected. You had made some comment like that. Then how do we know how our kids are comparing to other kids across the state or across the nation? Somebody's collecting data. I can't believe we would implement a standard and nobody is collecting data.
So fair point. Let me be clear. The standards and Common Core standards themselves, right, don't have anything in them. You can read them cover to cover, and there isn't anything that says collect data. Right? States are collecting data all the time. First of all, they're testing students all the time, and depending on how well the tests align with the standards, one way to find out how students are doing is to look at the test results. And there are a variety of kinds of analyses that states do to understand the performance of students. They look at how well students in different regions are doing, students from different backgrounds are doing. I think what's among the things that's important, at least important to me and I assume to everyone, is that the privacy of individual students be respected and honored, right, in whatever the data system is. One of the ways to do that is to make sure that the only people who see data that identifies individual students are the parents, right, and the teachers who need to know that, and that's it. So schools generally don't send data on individual students to the state education department, for example, where you could know how John Smith is doing compared to someone else. And you certainly want to make sure that no data that the state collects for the legitimate reasons that it does, none of that data that has any personally identifiable information is shared with the public, is shared with the business community, and is shared with the federal government. And if you don't have legal protections in statute now that provide for that, that would be something worth looking into, I think.
And my final question would be, is this going to be also applied to private schooling and homeschooling?
Those are decisions that vary from state to state. I
don't care about Michigan. I don't care about the other states.
Well, you guys are in charge of the laws in Michigan, not me. I don't know what the laws are.
Well, I mean, Common Core, this whole discussion did not come through the legislative process while I've been in the legislature, and I've been here since 2011. That's come through the Department of Board of Education and the state superintendent, and so I'm looking to see if this is intended to apply to homeschooling and private schooling as well.
I think it would only apply to private schooling and homeschooling if the statutes you already have, or those that you would create, either require them to apply to homeschooling or private schooling. You're in charge of that?
I think that's a question for Superintendent Flanagan.
Thank you.
We can move on to Representative Kniezing. By the way, I want to wrap this up in the next 2 or 3 minutes to get to Mike Flanagan.
No promises, but thank you. And thank you, Mr. Cohen. And I'd begin by thanking my colleague for pointing out the efforts that are being made across the country to try and sell this idea. You know, not too long ago we had to sell the idea of the Constitution as well, and it seems to have worked out pretty well for the United States so far. My question is in regards to standards versus curriculum, and you touched on this briefly, and I found in my conversations with some of my colleagues and with some individuals back home that there's a mentality of one or the other, that if we adopt Common Core, Michigan Merit Curriculum, or any of the other local control elements of our educational system are lost by adopting this Common Core. And so I was wondering if you could just talk about that at a bit of greater length and explain that while certainly we have standards and have goals and expectations, that local control or state control in regards to what the specific curriculum is going to be will still be maintained.
So I'm glad you asked that. So again, the standards are simply the statements of the outcomes of instruction that you want. The curriculum, right, the textbooks, the instructional materials, the instructional practices, the formative assessments that teachers might use, That's all the curriculum. It's the how to produce those outcomes. And you can see evidence around the country of different places and different organizations creating different curriculum for the Common Core. So I'll just give you two examples. One is Pearson is certainly creating curriculum materials for the Common Core, and they will sell them. Alternatively, you could go to a website called Engage New York, which is created by the New York State Department of Education. They have invested money in development of model curriculum for schools and school districts in New York State. They are open source. They are available to anyone for free. You can download it, you can use it, and I have no idea what the relationship between those materials is. One that's, I'm trying to remember the name of the organization that created it, but there's a literacy curriculum that people think highly of. I guarantee you it's not the same curriculum that Pearson is creating. They will both claim that they are aligned to the Common Core, and they probably are, but you've got some choice in which one you use, one you can pay for, one you could get for free.
Representative Verheulen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the interest of time, I'll be very, very brief. Thank you, Mr. Cohen, for being here. I think I heard you say that a state-by-state standard has been required and paid for by the federal government going back to the early 90s.
Right. Mm-hmm.
My question is, the federal government requires and pays for, did they in the 90s review and or approve those standards?
Absolutely not.
And they do not review and or approve the standards, the Common Core standards?
That's correct.
So I would be correct in saying that at no time has the federal government, nor does, or at least not expressing an interest in reviewing those standards. Well, then, just how do they say? Is it just a box they check? Here's a document. This is a standard from the state of Utah. Do they make sure there's some meaningful standard?
There is the first time that the federal government required states to have academic standards, right, was in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1994. I was in the Clinton administration when that was written and passed. I was the assistant secretary responsible for ensuring states complied with the requirement. And in order to make sure a state complied with the requirement that they had standards, they had to show a group of independent reviewers, not federal officials, that they had them. They literally had to say, here's a document. It's called the state standards. It's the math standards. You could flip it and see there's math in there. That was sufficient. They simply needed to have the standards. There was no federal review or approval of them at all.
And that hasn't changed up to today?
Has not changed at all, and there's language, statutory language, at least 3 different places that prohibits the Secretary of Education or anyone in the U.S. Department of Education for directing or controlling, or there's several other verbs like that, curriculum. And it happens to be written into the statute, the Title I statute that requires states to have standards. So it's very clear that the congressional intent here was states should have them and the federal government should not review or approve them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I trust your trip to Lansing was as good as mine coming to Grand Rapids yesterday.
Oh, yes. Good to see you again. We were at the same conference together yesterday, or wherever it was.
I want to kind of touch on this area in the language arts, and this is something I've heard as I get out in the district talking with different educators. And we had testimony earlier from the past curriculum director in the state of Massachusetts, and I think it's a known fact that Massachusetts has one of the best education systems in the state, in the country. So with that being said, when we look at language arts and we take the standard of using the classics, and I think that's what they built their standard on. And when you're studying the classics in language arts, it develops a higher level thinking skill.
Right.
Correct? All right. So now we're coming in, we're put into that standard the use of political reading material. Quite a different level of thinking strategy. And if we are developing the higher level thinking strategies, shouldn't that be adequate to stay with those classics? Because then what we're looking at as a national, and we talked about here, different states putting input. Now, my assumption is because she was so adamantly against this thing, she was put off in the back. And her views were not brought into this thing, kind of what Representative McMillan was touching on. Mm-hmm. And when we do that, then we get the term dumbing down education. If we believe that's a good standard, then let's put us all to the top standard and move forward with a good program.
So I appreciate you raising that. Let me say a couple of things in response, and I know you want to hurry up and finish. Number one, what the Massachusetts standards do that the Common Core doesn't, right, is include a reading list that has the classics in there. And Massachusetts does that because they chose to provide that kind of direction to their schools. Imagine, right, the conversation we'd be having if there was a required reading list in the Common Core. It is true, there is a reading list in Massachusetts.
That's not the only difference.
Oh, no. I'm just on this. It's not a straw man. It's one difference is that you can have kids read the classics when you tell them what to read. Right? The Common Core leaves the choice of literature and the choice of things to read open to the state and the district to deal with. Secondly, it does not crowd out that kind of literature. What it does is say, in English language arts, particularly at the high school level, we expect the English language arts teacher to continue to teach literature just the way they have been. But the other kinds of informational texts ought to be the province of the teachers in those other disciplines. So the science teacher ought to be responsible for making sure that students know how to approach a science text and understand it. The history teacher ought to be doing the same thing, and they ought to know they ought to help students learn how to read primary sources. So it doesn't diminish, right, the classics or the other literature in the Massachusetts standards. One other thing I would say, the person in question, Sandra Stotsky, was the curriculum director in Massachusetts. When the Common Core were being developed, she was a member of the Massachusetts State Board of Education, in addition to being on the validation panel. She had and took advantage of numerous opportunities to share her concerns with the other members of the State Board of Education, as well as the standards group, during the development process and during the adoption process. So it's significant to note, I think, that when the Massachusetts State Board decided whether to adopt the standards or not, despite the arguments, right, that Sandra Stotsky made, the board voted unanimously to adopt the standards. Her peers did not buy the argument that she's making.
Thank you.
And they know the Massachusetts standards well.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. Thank you very much, and we may have you back at another time if you're
happy to come
available.
If that's useful. Thank you.
Thank
you
you
very much for your attention.
Thank you. Next up, we're going to have Superintendent Mike Flanagan along with Linda Forward and Vince Dean. Mr. Flanagan.
Mr. Chair, how are you, sir? Members of the committee, appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. And we have a kind of a presentation, and then we're going to be available as long as you'd like for any questions and comments you might have. So thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the subcommittee for allowing me and our team here from Michigan Department of Ed to present to you the facts about the Common Core state standards and Smarter Balanced Assessment, and why they are the clear direction for the future of Michigan education and success for our students and schools. So Michigan's decisions to help develop and eventually, this will tie in, I'm going to try to integrate this with some of what Mike said, is why I got here at 9 o'clock, to try to make sure I'm not repeating too much. But Michigan's decisions to help develop and eventually adopt the Common Core state standards were, first, they were Michigan-initiated and Michigan-specific. We entered into a memorandum of understanding with the Council of Chief State School Officers, which is my group, and National Governors Association in May 2009 to participate in the development of the standards. This MOU, as Mike kind of inferred, did not obligate Michigan to adopt the standards, but gave us a firm say in how they were developed and the content that would be contained in them. I acted with 6 governors, 4 other of my counterparts, superintendents, sometimes they're called commissioners, in September of 2009 to select the validation committee for the Common Core state standards, which among its 29 members of renowned educators and scholars includes Michigan's own Bill Schmidt. You heard him referred to a number of times. And we pushed for him to be on that, by the way, because we knew he had this in his head with clarity, kind of the way Mike described it, the mile-wide, inch-deep stuff that we've been stuck with for 50 years. Once the standards were developed and published in their final form, Michigan followed state law in recommending and adopting them as Michigan's content standards for K-12 English language arts and mathematics. There was no predetermined intent or obligation to adopt the standards. Rather, Michigan's own elected officials, with the input and recommendation of me and the rest of the department, and educators and regular traditional citizens across the state took that action. So second, it's independent. The decision to adopt the standards was independent via the MOU to participation in development of the standards. The decision to adopt the standards was not in any way pressured or tied to other requirements by the federal government, as you've heard clearly from Mike and others over time. Third, it's based on the needs of Michigan students and educators. Michigan participated in the decision to develop the standards. That was a good thing. Michigan participated in the development of the standards. Michigan participated in the validation of the standards. Michigan's decision to adopt the standards was made based on overwhelmingly positive input from Michigan citizens about the quality of the standards 3 years ago. Fourth, they're based on rigorously solicited and analyzed feedback from Michigan citizens. So we conducted public comment periods throughout the development and adoption processes. Over 250 comments were collected from Michigan citizens and educators during the development phase of the Common Core state standards. We provided those per FOIA. We didn't need a FOIA, but we provided those to Representative McMillan and some others. Significant changes were made to the standards based on public comment before the standards were finalized. And then the statewide elected State Board of Education, who are nominated by their parties, discussed public comments, which were overwhelmingly supportive of the standards, in 2 public board meetings prior to the decision to adopt the standards. And these are Republicans and Democrats on the state board elected statewide. The Common Core state standards are the best foundation possible for ensuring career and college-ready Michigan graduates. This is for kids going directly into the workforce or those going to college. Built upon strengths and lessons learned from previous content standards from all states, including our own. They align with college and work expectations and are rigorous. They're internationally benchmarked and research-based. I mean, we're competing with China and Iowa. They pair rigorous and appropriate content with the critical thinking skills necessary to be successful in post-secondary education and work. I really believe you'll be convinced, and I think it's a worthy discussion, and I do think you will be convinced by the wide array of testimony that's going to be permitted in these 4 hearings over time before your subcommittee, that the direction we have all embarked on is positive, true, student data protected, and proper. So, of course, I asked the legislature to take its affirmative vote as quickly as possible to allow the department to expend funds to keep moving Michigan's system of education forward. The sooner we vote, by the way, teachers in the field today will have clarity as they engage in their normal summer professional development. They're not off for the summer. My daughter's a public school teacher working hard today. So as they do their normal summer professional development and preparation of lesson plans for their kids before all of their children return on September 3rd. So I now hand it over to a great team that I have the privilege of working with. Their assessments and curriculum, experts in curriculum and assessment, to present a few more things. And Wendy Larvick, who you all know. And we appreciate it.
Who will get us up.
Yep, and then just
Thank you.
use that for
That's right, okay. So our path to the Common Core state standards, in fact, predates 2004. This body gave us legislation for a curriculum framework in 1990 and other iterations that followed. But in 2004, the department asked the state board to approve the grade level content expectations, followed in 2006 by the approval of the merit curriculum and the high school content expectations, both of which were adopted in that year. 2009, we began to collaborate on the development of the content and development of the content expectations for the Model Core. For the Common Core state standards, and that was finalized in 2010 when the State Board of Education adopted those standards. How would standards be used? What would we do with them? First thing for you to know is that the standards guide local districts in the development of their district-based curriculum. So they make the decisions about where those standards will fall, how they will use them, what courses they'll be embedded in, and that's a local decision guided by the standards. Using the district curriculum, classroom teachers then begin to design their classroom instruction to best meet the needs of their students. In some districts, they develop pacing guides as well, which are district developed, but the teachers are the ones who make the final decisions about what the instruction looks like in the classroom. Model lesson plans are developed by intermediate school districts and educational organizations for use by districts and teachers, and that process is underway in the state at this time. And you should know that textbook companies align to the standards to assure that the material is covered, and you will find that most of them will claim that they have included the Common Core state standards in their materials. Also, using the standards, classroom assessments and district-level common assessments are developed by teachers and districts statewide in order to measure what's going on in the classroom. Additionally, statewide large-scale assessments are developed by the Department of Education, and in this case, the standards are guiding the work of the Smarter Balanced Consortium that we belong to. What this does is limit the guesswork about what material is covered on the test. Years ago, since I've been in this profession a while longer than some of the others at this table, when the MEEP first came out, we wondered, well, what was going to be on the test? And it was a guessing game for years because we didn't have some anchor standards to help guide what we needed to be teaching. Standards are the basis for school, district, and educator accountability. We need a common set of standards if we are going to hold the teacher, the district, and us as a state accountable for what we're supposed to do. We need to have that. Standards provide the yardstick. What is it that we expect students to know and be able to do? And that is the responsibility of the adults to provide the system that will get us to those standards. What do the standards allow us to do? One of the benefits of going with the Common Core state standards is that we have access to the best minds in content and in pedagogy in the country at no additional cost to Michigan. We're able to align with the requirements of business, industry, and higher education. You've heard about the TIMS study and some of the other issues that Michael Cohen raised, and those are important pieces that we would not normally be able to access on a state budget. We are able to provide Michigan teachers with examples of lesson plans that were successful in other classrooms, both in Michigan and across the country. We have online tools that are available to our teachers now that allow them to go in, and if they're going to teach a concept, they're able to go in and look at that concept and see if there's something in there that will help them design their own plan or to just use that plan if it seems like the right one. The standards provide ways to infuse real-world skills such as collaboration, use of a variety of sources, to formulate an opinion or position, and the strategic use of technology in the learning process. And I want to emphasize that one because in today's world, we need to have students able to utilize the technology and to make decisions about what they're finding online. I think that ad that talks about everything that's online is real, anything I saw on Facebook is real, and the French model comes down the street is a perfect example of why kids have to be able to take a look at what the data looks like and make some decisions. Also, the system will allow us to personalize individual student learning needs. Technology can play a role in this, and the fact that we're going to be able to have more and more rapid feedback to the teacher in the classroom about how the student is doing at acquiring sets of information will help them then design the next lesson plan or specialized learning for students. The alignment of the Common Core state standards it was good. We had a good alignment with what we had prior to the standards when we looked at what we already had in content expectations. In terms of content, there was not much difference. What is different is that there is a larger emphasis on complex skills that students need to be able to perform. For instance, students now need to be able to engage in discussion and reasoning, both in writing and verbally, and in all kinds of classes, not just their math and English language arts classes, science, social studies, other classes. They need to problem solve applying disparate facts, knowledge, and skills to real-world situations. communicate and collaborate to arrive at solutions to real-world situations with their peers and others. That's what we do in the work world. We talk to others, we have conversations, and we make decisions. And they need to be able to strategically use technology and other tools to aid them in their work. Teachers continue to decide how best to integrate these skills into classroom decision. Where might they use it, and where might they not choose to utilize it? So in our transition to the new standards, there are a set of roles here. MDE provides the role of technical assistance, rollouts, some professional development, and assessment and accountability. It remains to the local districts, intermediate school districts, and teachers to determine how those standards look in the classroom to provide good student learning. So to take you through this, and I'll go fairly quickly through these slides. In 2010-11, the Common Core state standards were adopted by the Michigan State Board of Education, and MDE then played a role. We provided large-scale rollouts, regional rollouts, which were paid for by registration fees, and introduced participants to the standards and implementation timeline through the 2014-15 school year so that they knew what to expect. Districts and ISDs that year began to align the current curriculum to the new standards, had discussions about what might need to change and what could stay the same. And the Michigan Association of Intermediate School Districts began development of model unit plans in mathematics and English language arts to guide teachers in the design of their classroom work. Districts and ISDs in 2011-12 provided professional learning opportunities for teachers to support implementation at the classroom level, and that's some of the work that's going on this summer as they continue to dig deeper into the standards and provide training for classroom teachers in order to decide what the instructional models would look like. MAISA unit plans were piloted and then rolled out via the MAISA website, and you can find those unit plans at that site. Teachers increasingly utilize technology in their lesson plans and begin implementing the Common Core state standards in their classroom. So the implementation in the classroom began in 2011-12. In 2012-13, the year just finished, teachers and districts were continuing with their implementation, and were making the transition to the infusion of technology into the lesson plans. MDE now began providing sample assessment items and pilot testing for Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium, and Vince will talk to you a little bit more about that. Coming this next year, classrooms and district-level implementation will continue, but now we'll be at the point where we can get some feedback on classroom progress and sample assessments items and pilot tests. Classroom teachers will fine-tune their lesson plans and expectations. Technology will continue to be a part of this work, and the Smarter Balanced field testing will continue. In 2014-15, classroom and district-level implementation continue. The first operational Smarter Balanced assessments will be given, and teachers will now be able to get rapid feedback to statewide assessments. There's a projected 2-day turnaround for those who do the online assessments. As you see, this is a progression, and as you can see, the department, while it provided some guidance, most of the work has remained at the district and classroom level. And so we just wanted to give you that kind of visual to point that out. Technology is going to play a greater and greater role in personalized learning for all students, and we need to help students to learn to utilize that technology in smart ways. Teachers need to harness the power of technology to customize learning for all students. How can you take a topic that's being taught, and when you have the students who are soaring, lead them down some more challenging work, while you have students who need some remediation going into some other site where they can get some skill building that they might need. To be successful, teachers need the tools to work with. In-class technology, computers, tablets, whatever kind the district chooses. The infrastructure behind that technology, and training on how to blend technology into their lesson plans. And we are so grateful to this body for giving us a methodology to begin to put this in place. Understanding how technology can enhance the content delivery, and they need support for the technology when it isn't working, which means they need somebody that they can call on when the computers go down. In order for students to maximize their learning, they need access to technology for homework and project work with classmates. The new models for learning mean that learning will go on when it's most conducive to the student. And so kids need to be able to take that tablet or that iPad or whatever it is, the computer, home, and be able to access the web no matter what their economic levels are. And that's a challenge that we're going to have to address as we move forward. In order for teachers to make wise choices about technology, they need ready access to classroom sets of computers and tablets at a minimum, and so that technology is based on student need and they can determine when and where to use the technology and apply it. We've got some samples of what's different about math and English language arts, just to kind of help you. Under a grade level content expectation, students were asked to mentally calculate simple products and quotients up to a 3-digit number, 500, multiplying it by a 1-digit number involving multiples of 10. And so 500 is a multiple of 10 times 6, or 400 is a multiple of 10 divided by 8. Pretty simple, straightforward calculations. What we ask students to do under the Common Core State Standards is to take a look at multiples in a range of 10 to 90. And then be able to do multiplication facts. For instance, 9 times 80 seems like a big problem until you say to a student, well, if you try 9 times 5, or 9 times 8, and then make the digit change over so that it's by hundreds, they learn to be able to make the calculations very quickly in their head. 5 times 6 is 30, so 5 times 60 must be 300. And being able to make those strategies in their head is one of the changes that we're putting into the Common Core State Standards. Next one, linear equations have been around forever. Any algebra student can tell you that. A high school content expectation would ask students to perform that and justify their steps. Under the Common Core State Standards, they will still have to do linear equations. I think the big difference is they then have to create their own based on real-world problems and determine what they need to put into that equation. Nice thing is that computers will help them do that. English language arts you heard that one of the criticisms was that we were very process heavy in English language arts, and indeed use the writing process to produce and present a research project, and this goes on to talk about what that project would entail. Under Common Core, we would ask them to conduct short research projects that build knowledge about a topic. I'll tell you that my grandson participated in one of these standards on the Common Core this spring, and he had to use a disparate array of sources, and he had to go in and evaluate them and evaluate their validity and then bring that information into a paper he had to write, and he had to take a stance, and the project was on fracking. And I thought, well, that's interesting, and yes, it's an interesting topic today. It's a very hot topic, but it was interesting to me the other day. He saw an ad on TV and he said, that's about fracking. And then he went right on down the points that he had learned. And so he had internalized that as opposed to doing the question and answer sheet out of the reading of the book and filling out a form. And then finally, students in the high school level had to develop and use tools and practices of inquiry and research and to create a hypothesis and a thesis. That same sort of thing will go on, but in this case, they'll be asked to do shorter bursts, and then that will lead them to doing greater and deeper inquiry into other fields that appear as a result of their inquiry. So those are just some of the differences. After the standards are implemented during the 14-15 school year and beyond, we need to know whether or not students are reaching career and college-ready levels. Have they learned anything? I can't tell you how many times I've had teachers say, well, I taught it, and that was great, but the issue is, did the student learn it? We need rigorous assessments to measure that knowledge and make sure that the standards have been learned. And the results of the assessments need to be readily available to the teacher so he or she can meet learning needs of all students. And Vince is going to help you understand part of that work.
Good morning. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today to provide you with some information about the Smarter Balance Assessment Consortium and make a few comments that I'll keep fairly brief in the interest of time here. This is our current map of the states that are actively participating in Smarter Balance. These are states that have come together really around this common purpose of measuring the Common Core State Standards and trying to provide as many tools and as much information as we can to really show how students are progressing in terms of career and college readiness throughout our K-12 system. In addition to that, these are states that have come together with a common philosophy around how to go about that process of measurement. And just the color coding there, the green states are governing states like Michigan, heavily involved with Smarter Balance and able to weigh in on and vote on every type of policy and operational decision the consortium makes. The blue and red states there are advisory or affiliate states that are aware of the consortium's activities but do not get to vote or weigh in on any of the substantive decisions. This slide, just to give it kind of the end in mind, again, all students prepared to be successful in a post-secondary educational setting in light of the Common Core standards and how we are trying to build tools in a system that provides teachers and schools with the types of information they need to really know if students are on track and then provide supports where necessary. So Smarter Balance has been very committed to this idea of a balanced system where we would have summative, high-stakes, secure tests that would inform our accountability systems across these states, have interim assessments or benchmark-type tests that would allow students, teachers to know within a school year if students are on track to do well on the high-stakes tests, and provide a rich resource in the form of a digital library of high-quality sample items, instructional tools, and resources that all teachers in any of the member states would have access to 24/7, 365 to be able to use as they see or feel appropriate in their local context to support student learning. Michigan, as I mentioned, over the last 3 years that this work has been going on, we've had not folks that have just been made aware of Smarter Balance, but as you see here, over 58 folks that have been substantively involved with various aspects of the consortium's work. So we've had Michigan educators involved in item development, item reviews, helping to think through some of the scoring aspects of things there. We've had strong involvement from our Michigan institutions of higher education in the form of representatives from our President's Council and our Michigan Community College Association that have weighed in on a number of topics that Smarter Balance is working on, such as what the grade 11 assessment will measure, where cut scores might be set, some of those type of topics. And then Michigan Department of Education staff have been involved participating and leading different work groups that are tackling various aspects of the consortium, such as design, item writing, reporting, some of those aspects. And Dr. Joseph Martineau, our Deputy Superintendent for Accountability Services, that couldn't be here today because of illness, he's co-chair of the Smarter Balance Executive Committee, which oversees all the consortium's work. So he's heavily involved in all the decision-making that goes on as we work towards ensuring that this system, to the extent possible, will meet Michigan's needs. Because of this heavy involvement that we've had, we know that throughout this initial development phase that we're about to enter the fourth and final year of the development, and through this future, the sustainability of this consortium, that we're going to continue to own and be responsible for critical assessment and reporting things that we always have, such as how these are delivered to our schools, how the reports and scores come about, how the results are used in the accountability system. We will still own and control all those as we have in the past. We'll continue to be able to lead and shape what Smarter Balance does, how it evolves over time to meet some of the evolving issues like Linda mentioned around technology. And we will always have opportunities to contribute our expertise in the development of test items as all items that appear on a Smarter Balance assessment will be written by educators from across the states that are participating and reviewed by multiple groups of teachers and other folks before they ever appear on a test. And again, as we have these conversations that have been involved in this work, we're able to keep comparisons like this you see here of these different features that we're seeing, that we've had for years through MEEP and Michigan Merit Exam, and that we're seeing being developed through Smarter Balance that note specific areas of improvement or strength that we'll be able to utilize in this state as a result of participating in this consortium. So just a couple of examples, being able to leverage the advantages of computer adaptive testing will be possible through Smarter Balance, online assessment delivery, and as Linda mentioned, much quicker data and reports coming back to teachers and schools for their use to guide and inform instruction, and being able to measure content areas that we see in the Common Core standards, like listening and research, that require different types of test items to really get a handle on how students are doing on that. We'll be able to have measures in those areas through our participation in Smarter Balanced. And fundamentally, this leads us to conclusions we're able to draw about what does Michigan need in a next generation assessment system to support the different types of reform initiatives and things like the complex skills that Linda described that we see in the Common Core standards. And we're able to really clearly document why this is going to be better than what we've been able to do with MEP and Michigan Merit Exam from the resource perspective. So we have things like the critical thinking, the problem solving that Linda described. Very difficult to thoroughly measure student achievement or understanding with multiple choice items, which dominates what we were able to afford to use on MEP and Michigan Merit Exam. With Smarter Balance, we'll have technology-enhanced items, or like little mini scenarios, many more items that will require students to generate short essays or write and be able to demonstrate their thinking in that way. A lot of much stronger ways for them to demonstrate and assess the breadth of what we see in the Common Core standards and those complex skills, which are very important if we're to have a meaningful accountability system there. So to bring this kind of back up in terms of grain size, this has been an absolutely transparent and state-led process. Michigan's involvement on all the Smarter Balanced work groups and different aspects of policy and other decision-making there. We know how this assessment system is going to function. We know how it's going to work. We know that it's going to be superior to what we're able to do here because we've been integrally involved with the development throughout. In terms of the control of both in current and in the future, Michigan's the second largest state in terms of number of students impacted and working on this, second only to California. So because of that, we're able to leverage that and bring our voice and advocate very strongly for the things that we believe very passionately are needed from an assessment system like this one. In terms of data, we're going to be having multiple measures through like the interim or benchmark assessments in addition to the summative assessments that we haven't been able to have. But with this richer data, we're not going to have any loss of control over that data. And I'll speak a little bit more about that in a second here. And the cost issue is a very big issue as well for us that we're excited to see mature, because when you have all these states contributing resources, all of them participating in development, contributing to solutions for scoring and reporting, you get to a point where that collective capacity really plays out in our favor from a cost perspective, and I'll show a little bit more about that in a second here. On the data front, fundamentally, this echoes just what Mr. Cohen described in detail. States have been, are, and will continue to be the sole owners of their individual student data. We're not talking about any new data in terms of assessment that would be collected through Smarter Balance compared to what we collect currently under MEP or Michigan Merit Exam. Have some examples included there, and today we'll be able to provide you with the full list of student data variables, and you'll be able to see the relatively few that are required versus the other ones that are optional. And we work very closely in the department with our Center for the Educational Performance and Information, who is responsible for managing, as you know, a lot of this data. And I'm sure they'd be happy to come and speak and address any concerns that you may have about that. A specific point about the student data that I wanted to mention is this idea that, again, Mr. Cohen also spoke to, about personally identifiable versus non-personally identifiable. So in the Smarter Balance Memorandum of Understanding, you'll see a reference in there to student-level data. And what that primarily is a reporting issue, a reporting guarantee, that through Smarter Balance, states would still get individual student, a record of an individual student, what performance. So what test items they saw, how they did on all those items, how that played out in the scoring. However, Smarter Balance will not have that data connected to any personally identifiable information, such as name or birth date. When students are registered or signed up to take a Smarter Balance test, they'll be assigned a specific code or number for that there. But only the state of Michigan will be able to match that up with our state unique identifying code and be able to tie that information back to a specific student in a school in Michigan. Smarter Balance will not have that personally identifiable information. And Smarter Balance, just like we're required to now, will agree or will it be adhering to all federal laws that guarantee safety for student education records and privacy, such as the FERPA Act. So that's something that, if that wasn't in place, that would be a deal breaker for all states. And so, in terms of the cost, I have some updated cost information for you. The last cost information we provided to the legislature was in April. These cost pieces here reflect a few updates. They reflect more actual costs that are updated versus some estimates that we had back in April. The questions that we were responding to and generating cost information for in April were specific to MEP and the Michigan Merit Exam. These figures also include represent students that take our MEP Access Assessment, which is an alternate assessment for students with disabilities that will be a student population covered under Smarter Balance. So for an apples to apples, what we do now versus where we're going with Smarter Balance, it's appropriate to include those students. And we have additional information after now going through 3 years of doing online test pilots on like MEP, for example. And so we have some estimates that have been refined about what it really costs paper pencil versus online testing that are reflected in these here. So I'll just on the left-hand side in the blue box there, those are our current per student costs and aggregate program costs, just so you have those. And those are based on where we are now with essentially 100% paper pencil or print type tests. On the right-hand side, we see two future scenarios. So you'll notice the or there. So it's not doubling the cost. It's two different scenarios based on where we think we're likely to be out of the gate with Smarter Balanced, which is that lower right-hand purple box there, which are cost reflective, our best estimates of if we were 75% of our schools are able to take the assessments online out of the gate in 14-15, but we still have a significant number of schools and districts that aren't quite ready yet for the minimum requirements for online testing, so we would need some paper pencil options there. And then the upper right-hand box is our cost estimates where we really start to see some of the efficiencies of transitioning to online assessment, because when you get it 100% online or very nearly so, and you're dramatically reducing the amount of paper that you're printing and packing and shipping and receiving, all those things, there's some substantial cost savings after that transition is complete. So that information concludes our presentation, and we're happy to address any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. We're likely to run a little over. I'd like to accommodate as many questions as possible. We've got 7 representatives that would like to ask a question, so just be cognizant of the time for others. Representative Pagel.
I'd like to thank each of you for your presentations. And it's a pleasure to be here. My question is a kind of a plea for help. I've waded into some discussions on the local district level in my district with some people who basically are pretty violently opposed to Common Core. And I guess I will concentrate mostly on the issue of local control. It gets thrown back at me, well, it's a federal takeover, well, it's a private organization takeover. I've even had otherwise intelligent, well-informed people say the United Nations is really behind this. But my counter is that it's not a curriculum, it's standards, that each district has the ability to choose its own technology, to hire its own teachers, to set their own class sizes, their own facilities, to find the best way to teach to these standards, and that innovation in general will bubble up as we see successful classrooms here and there, and everyone can learn from that. But it keeps getting thrown back to me, well, this is one-size-fits-all education. The districts really won't be free to choose their curriculum because they're going to have to teach to this test, so they're all going to be doing the same thing, one size fits all. Can you give me any help?
Well, I'll start, but I have to admit it just is bizarre to me. I had the same arguments from people I respect, too. So this isn't about people not genuinely feeling what they're feeling. But you couldn't possibly have orchestrated, when you hear what Mike and what we've presented, somehow if you wanted to align with the United Nations or whatever that's about. You look at the process that was involved. And then ultimately, I mean, a little of our frustration, if I may say, has just been that we're well on our way 3 years ago. The body that's authorized to do this is the State Board of Education. Now, we know you have, obviously, the appropriate power on appropriations, so we're respectful of that, and I'm here and changed the calendars to be here. But it just isn't accurate, and I hope there's some ammunition inherent in almost 2 hours that you've heard today. But I thought you captured it beautifully, actually, kind of what the reality of this is. You know. And so there's a point where the curriculum, the textbooks, all of those things are still going to be local control. Now, having said that, I'm a person that you've put in between the crosshairs in a way on a different issue related to local control, which if Thursday when we have a hearing, if the treasurer and I believe some criteria is met that you've put together, I've got to dissolve districts. So, I mean, there's a whole discussion about local control as we move through this anyway right now. And this is just, I don't, you know, Melanie and I talked to her, I respect people who see this differently, but it just, you know, I've had the same kind of response that you have, Representative, when I see that. My argument is kind of like, how could you possibly do this if that was even the intent with the process we went through? But it just isn't. This was meant to have clarity, to have fewer as the Bill Schmidt type model. Bill Schmidt was, you know, you've heard him praised a number of times here. It also gets to kind of Professor Chow, who used to be with Michigan State, because he's not a multiple, as we are not, multiple choice test type person. This gets us, as Vince said, a way, you know, leaps and bounds beyond that.
I think one thing to add to that argument is that this body and its counterpart has put in place for decades standards requirements and has asked that we do standards in a variety of shapes and forms. And local control has remained throughout all of that. And so I anticipate that it will continue in this one. So that might be a useful tool.
Representative Shore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have two questions, one general and one based on the presentation, so take them in whatever order. The general question is, when we went through this in the budget, and you know this has been referenced, we heard there would be no Common Core, smarter balance moving forward if we don't take an affirmative action. And I've heard from my superintendent and teachers and a variety of people in my district about how much money has been spent in the 3 years up until now. So I'm trying to figure out, you know, how much do you think was spent, including professional development, textbooks, you know, whatever else, moving to this place, and if we don't do anything, how much in essence are we wasting? That's a big issue for me. My second question is based on the technology need that you have in your presentation. I agree with all of that, but you know, when I look at my school district, you know, we've got in my children's school, we've got a computer lab with maybe 30 computers. So the kids go in and they rotate going into that computer lab. But they don't have, you know, an individual computer in their classroom, and they don't have tablets to take home. I wish they did, but they don't. So where is the funding coming from to get to something like that? Because when you're going from a student who needs it in the classroom and they have to roll in a computer and it's probably a few years old to every student having a tablet to bring home with them, that's a big, big leap, and I don't know where the funding comes from for that.
You know, I mean, I don't mean to be flippant, but ideally it would be a kind of a special line item at some point in time. But given that we spent, you know, in some cases $15,000 a child, in other cases the base amount, that, you know, with the driving technology costs that are going down to handhelds being so inexpensive, I really don't think that's going to be the issue we all think it's going to be. But you know, if I put my educator hat on, and ideally, we would like a special appropriation to try to deal with that across the board. We've got almost 2 million students if you count our preschool kids. But I do think districts are and have demonstrated that they've been buying these things on a regular basis and trying to get ready. We used funds that I think Representative Rogers' committee started with, and then the legislature appropriated to help us get a sense of that and a handle on that. And I think we're well on our way. That $50 million last year, and East Lansing, I think, is quite ahead of the curve, and Lansing, on these issues. On the first item, I don't know. I would yield to both of my colleagues. I was a local superintendent 20 years ago, and then I was an ISD superintendent. This is what we do. And an enormous amount of money has been spent in 3 years. I don't know how, and maybe there is a way to quantify that, but they came out of the block, they started working towards this, and especially as people understood it, they realized this was going to help them be clearer about, for example, if you're teaching, and if there's not clarity about what to teach in math in second grade and what to teach in math in third grade, even if the kid's in the same elementary school, there's going to be a problem. They haven't learned the fundamental things they have to in second grade in order to succeed in third grade. And that alignment issue has been a problem.
Let me ask you that in a different way, though. So if we move forward and we don't take an affirmative action, is that 3 years of expense lost if we go back to the MEP, or does that translate over?
Well, go ahead.
It will depend on our next steps. Certainly the content expectations and high school expectations are in place, and that's what MEP is aligned to, and MME, and so we could move forward. But yes, there's a vast amount of work that has been lost, a vast amount of expense that has been put in place by local districts. You asked how much. We don't know, because that is a local issue and not ours. And so we will have lost a great deal. In addition to that, we'll have to make a decision about what we do. Remember that standards are required, and so we will have to decide what those standards look like going forward.
According to the letter, are we losing federal waivers and AYP? Is that right, according to the letter?
If we lose our flexibility waiver, and that requires that we have a Common Core or some other set, and because we don't have one that has been set up for career and college ready, we then have to go back to our set of standards and change them to raise them up to the level of career and college ready. What happens then, meanwhile, we go back to the old set of requirements under the federal legislation, and that will put us in a situation by 2014, this next summer, where AYP will not be met.
By anyone.
By anyone.
And I know, on the surface, when we even first thought about that implication when this all first started, we thought, well, if everyone doesn't make AYP, it kind of doesn't mean anything. It shows unless you realize what everyone is going to have to do because they don't make AYP. And then I would just add, and Vince could give better sense of this, but losing the economies of scale of Smarter Balance. So there's some districts that think, well, we're still going to go with the Common Core. We're local control. We can have that. It's not going to align to the tests we have if we don't have the Smarter Balance.
Yeah, it'd be a huge loss if we went back to the MEP piece, because we have such a really powerful and strong agreement with higher education, for example, that when students arrive in a post-secondary education setting, they need that critical thinking, that basic research skills, the problem solving. We would go back to not being able to measure those types of aspects and have a sense of whether or not students are on track to be high functioning in those areas.
Representative Singh.
Sure. Just very quickly, 3 quick questions. When the Constitutional Board voted on this, what was the vote on that?
I think it was 8-0. I think it was unanimous.
It was a unanimous vote.
Republicans and Democrats, and after a lot of thought, as I outlined in my comments.
Sure. I appreciate that. The second question is, I notice there's about 24, 25 states that are doing the Smarter Balance. What are other states doing, and are there any other states that are going on their own, or are they just part of another consortium?
Yes, as Mr. Cohen mentioned, there are 2 of these multi-state consortia. So there's Smarter Balance, which has the states there. The other large one is about 20 states. That's PARC, as Mr. Cohen mentioned there. There are a few other states that have either not adopted the Common Core standards and so then aren't eligible to participate in the development. So Texas, Virginia, for example, Minnesota adopted the Common Core and ELA, but not mathematics, so they're still working on their own assessment system.
And then the last question, when you take a look at data and privacy, that seems to be a significant issue that I've heard recently. How are we doing anything different from 3 years ago under the MEP to when we're moving towards this standard balanced program?
Now, with regard to data or the student identifiable versus not, all those things would be still required to be secure in the state of Michigan, and so we would not be releasing that or giving access to that for any other entities.
No difference.
Right. Thank you.
Representative Yonker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. looking at this test, I mean, I want to kind of look at the MEEPs and where we're at with what's happened in our classrooms. When we go into the MEEP and we get ready for the MEEP test when they're coming out, our classrooms have been focused on that test, and we'll spend 2 to 3 weeks to make sure our students are ready because we're looking at proficiency. So we get them enough information to do well on a test, but they never mastered a skill. So one of the things that we're talking about with this, the big change is the mile wide and the inch deep. So and I like what we're talking about, but what we see and plan and what we do are sometimes two different things. So what I'm hearing when it comes to this testing, now we're doing a smart balance testing, which is going to be national. And so now we're not only going to hold our schools and our teachers accountable to that we're doing now on a state level, but we're going to do it on a national level. And so the concern that I hear from teachers is, are you going to beat me up now over other states? Number one concern, and rightly so, in their schools. And then are we going to allow our teachers to be able to teach to the depth, especially in the elementary levels, when every kid learns so differently? Are we going to give them that opportunity to make this? Because if we don't, this ain't going to work. We can talk about a mile deep and a mile wide, but if we don't give our teachers the ability to do it, then we're here wasting our time today. So if you could address that whole issue, and how the department is going to deal with this.
In very broad terms, Representative, I mean, this is a complex issue. You look, for instance, I have the authority, and I took away the ability to do teacher prep from 2 institutions because they aren't helping teachers do exactly what you're saying. That's a teacher preparation, that's a professional development issue on how they're going to, no matter what the standards are, no matter whether it's MEEP or Smarter Balance, it wouldn't be both, what are the strategies they're using in their classroom? So, I mean, there's a point where, somewhat in fairness to the educator prep institutions, and there's 32 of them here, and we review them and we regularly work with them. They're faced with they don't have the same accountability, frankly, that teachers have right now. I mean, with the new laws, and I'm largely supportive of thoughtful evaluation of teachers, although I wish we were able to get a fair series of tests in place first, and I know you're waiting for the council to report back to you. But there's a point where I'm getting off here a little bit, but to your major point, I think it has to do with a variety of things, including the teacher prep institutions and having teachers well prepared for a whole different world. We're not preparing kids to work on a line anymore. If you've been to the Caddy plant nearby here, these folks are doing probability and statistics as so-called line workers. And they can get this from Lansing Community College. They can get this from their high school. I think Representative O'Brien brought up a good point earlier, that these VOC centers, these CTE centers, so many of them are integrating this stuff into their actual work so that they don't have to wait for a community college degree to do it. But it really, all of those issues are not, they're important, they're not connected to this decision. This decision is clarity on those outcomes, those standards that we expect kids to be able to know, and skills that they're able to demonstrate.
I think, too, helping teachers, and we've been working on this for several years now, and we continue to do that, to understand multi-tiered systems of support. And that gets to your point of kids come into school at different levels, and they have different strengths, and we need to be able to increase those and build on those weaknesses. And those systems of support have to be put in place. And it is a different way of thinking, and it goes back to my issue of the teacher says, I taught it, but did the kid learn it? Well, when we find out that the child did not learn some matter, what is the support mechanism that helps shore that child up while the others are able to move forward? We're trying to put that in place across the state, and it is something that is probably going to take us a few more years, but it is there, and teachers are using it and maximizing students' ability to learn.
But so my second question to that then is, going to a smarter balance, and this is a big concern, where we're being lumped in with the national level testing, would it be smarter for the state to do our own test? Like SAT, they have a growth test like this, and so we don't get into this danger of going into this level of beating ourselves up on something that we got some groundwork to do yet.
I wish Joseph could be here today, and Vince did a great job as a quick backup because Joseph's ill today. But Joseph's the co-chair of this. We almost got the best of all worlds. We got this a tremendous investment in assessment that we never, through no fault of yours, we never would have been able to be appropriated enough money to put this nuanced test together. And in so many ways, it's ours. I mean, we've been the key in terms of any state in developing it. So a national test in the sense that a lot of folks who join this consortium are going to be part of it, yeah. But it's not a national test like the Department of Ed test, and it's totally developed by states, but in our case, we have a totally disproportionate impact on that. Vince wants to.
And we'll also, with as participation in Smarter Balance, we'll get way beyond what we're able to do now currently with MEEP and MME, where we have these once-a-year, one-shot tests that give some broad information, but that don't help us get down to the level of informing instruction that we would like. And so with Smarter Balance, we'll have things like the interim and benchmark tools, the formative assessment resources, to really give teachers much better sense of, are they hitting those levels of depth you mentioned and making progress on there, and give them multiple ways to look at student achievement.
And then our plan, just as one more point on that, was our plan is and has been to this fall would be the last MEEP, and then it would be about a year and a half till the spring of Smarter Balance, when we would prefer to have the testing take place in the spring anyway, so we don't run into some of what you were describing about the fall issues.
Thank you. Representative McMillan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So regarding the assessments, as I understand it, the agreement with the consortium says that we have to adopt Common Core in order to be in the consortium. So the assessments are going to be based on the Common Core standards, right?
Correct.
I mean, you're not going to assess things that are not in Common Core. So, if we have assessments based on Common Core, the districts are buying Common Core aligned textbooks for a reason. Teachers are going to teach what's on the test because, especially if Dr. Flanagan, I don't know, there's a discussion about tying Smarter Balance to merit pay. Have you decided that that's a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I think that is a local control issue. I mean, as some of you have mentioned, I think their individual contracts determine whether.
So that shouldn't be done at the state level because there's bills to talk about that. So you don't.
I mean, in spirit, I think a well thought out merit system. There's a place for it, especially since we're going to have assessments that can take into account growth.
Teacher evaluations and others are going to be based on how these kids are doing, especially the growth. So they're certainly going to teach to the test. And so I really wish we would get away from this idea that they're only standards. They will decide curriculum. Standards are you test standards with assessments and you teach to the test. That's what happens. And there are some conservatives and others like Robert Scott, the former superintendent in Texas, state superintendent, who is really reevaluating these high-stakes testing, that they are not doing what was intended. They're actually forcing teachers to teach to the tests, and that it's not, like Representative Yonker said, they don't have the option to say, this is what's best for little Susie here, I'm going to do that. No, they don't. I mean, if the lattice method is extremely confusing to a child, but it's going to be on the assessment, will the teacher have to teach the child the lattice method?
The lattice method is a technique, an instructional strategy to help kids understand multiplication and division, and that's a strategy that can be utilized. It's a methodology. It is not a standard. A standard says that students need to be able to multiply and divide. Teaching to the test is something that any good teacher does. I was a Spanish teacher. I knew that I was teaching the present tense of AR verbs, and at the end of whatever period of time, I wanted kids to be able to do that, and so I outlined what my lesson plan would look like for that period of time and then gave the test. It's not teaching the test, it's teaching to the test.
Yeah, and I would like to add to that. I mean, there's a mythology, and I have to admit, when I, early in my career, it drove me nuts that it felt like cattle herded into teaching to a test. But the universe of what these standards represent is here, and the test is here. So, yeah, I mean, I would acknowledge, of course, that we want Monroe and Marquette to understand that algebra needs to include the Pythagorean theorem. You know, that you don't really want to have a kid, whether they're going into a career tech sequence right out of high school or whether they're going to college, to not understand. And so it's those kind of things that got vetted in this very complicated but thorough way that Mike exhibited earlier and we tried to add to. But that doesn't mean that you could have a year where I guess the Pythagorean theorem wouldn't be tested.
Okay. But, I mean, this is a very simple question, and I'll have to ask it again because there was no answer. If the lattice method is confusing to a child, but it's going to be on the assessment, will the teacher have to teach that child the lattice method?
No, I think it was answered, sir, but go ahead.
So the answer is yes or no?
The answer is more complex than that, sir, because you're posing a question about an instructional methodology, not a standard.
Is it going to be on the test, Mr. Vince? I don't know your last name, but is lattice? Are they going to have to know the lattice method on the assessment?
What's represented by the standards is what we're expected to measure.
Yes or no, please.
It's not a simple question.
For goodness sake, that is why you guys drive the confusion.
Representative McMillan, this is a bit more specific, and I think that it's something that you can probably get offline with them. Whether or not
there's a reason they don't want to answer this question. Whether or not a specific question is going to be on a test is not going to be something that would be forwarded. We need to know
anyway.
that here. This is this.
We'll
the
move
fact
on.
that they will. Okay, let's go to governing structure because I think that's real important. We are turning over our standards to the NGA, and they are going to be deciding. We entered into
Representative. That is not at all what with the testimony that we heard earlier. This is not turned over to the NGA. Achieve was the collector of this information, not the National Governors Association.
Well,
don't confuse.
Let me ask my question, Mr. Flanagan. We entered into some discussion in writing, and you basically said if we don't like a standard, our chance to change that has passed, and that we will have some opportunity. They'll listen to us potentially, but who knows? I would hope that we need to know what is the structure going to be, who's going to be making these decisions that says that this is a good standard or this is a bad standard. Is it going to be an open process so that we have minutes and open meetings? Is it going to be deliberative? Is there going to be votes? I mean, what exactly is the structure of the NGA, and who is deciding what the standards are going to be? What's the structure?
The standards have been developed, and that's been decided already, and Mr. Cohen took you through that process earlier in his testimony. So the standards are developed, that's finalized, and Michigan did a crosswalk to those standards in a very public way, asked for information and feedback from our public, and then in public testimony at the state board level made the decision that they would adopt the standards. So the standards are done and adopted, and now we move into the implementation of those standards in the local districts as well as the assessment.
Well, the NGA has said clearly that standards are going to change in the future.
Absolutely. Standards always change.
Okay, so who makes those decisions?
Changed again,
and
then we would have to go through and would be happy to go through the same process we went through with the state board 3 years ago in a public way with the comments that we received. If those were to change and to be adopted, they'd have to be adopted in public by the state board, any changes. Otherwise, we have what we have. There's no...
But who makes this... I'm asking a question.
State board.
I'll have to re-ask the question.
The state board. He has answered the question, Representative. It's the state board by the Michigan Constitution is in charge of all things education.
I didn't ask. They're not answering my question.
I have no idea.
Let's move on.
Governing structure.
Representative Rogers.
Well, this is exactly
Representative Rogers.
Confusion and
now the state board would make those in a public setting over months, the way they did the first time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple of constituent questions, and it's come up a couple of times. But how were teachers and parents approached in regard to this process so that they could have feedback through this when we were making those decisions? And approximately how many participated, to your knowledge?
The standard process for any of these sorts of things is to publicly announce through information out to districts, and sometimes with a press announcement as well, but I'm not clear about that in this process. We go out and we ask for public feedback. There were between 200 and 300 responses. I don't have the number firmly etched in my brain. And the conversations also are held in regional meetings as development is going on, that it's brought up with stakeholder groups. And the PTA has been aware of this, and I think you'll probably hear from them later, but they have been aware of the process as well.
Okay. And secondly, in regard to the Smarter Balance or the park, how did we decide how was that dictated as to which one we decided to go with, out of curiosity?
We engaged with conversations again 3 years ago as these consortia were coming together around, as I mentioned, that the deficiencies in some of the assessments that had been existing prior that Mr. Cohen described in terms of what states felt they needed in terms of moving forward. So we were able to do some comparing of where they were headed as they developed their proposals to be funded. We believe very strongly that the computer adaptive testing, that Smarter Balanced, is the direction they're going, which Park is not, was a key driver for our decision there, as well as how the states that belong to Smarter Balanced think about and view benchmark assessment and formative assessment.
And this will essentially eliminate the rest of the tests. I keep hearing frequently from the system that we're testing almost every single day, it feels like. And by the way, as just an editorial comment, it seems to me that we were always taught and had to teach to the test, or even as a student, I studied things that I figured might be on the test, so I would pass. Right. So the reality is that is going to happen regardless. And you were very upset when you studied something that wasn't on the test, so you weren't really prepared. But anyhow, does this get rid of a lot of these other tests so we can focus on this?
Yes, these would be replacing MEEP, Michigan Merit Examination, and MEEP Access. So it wouldn't be adding tests to be replacing.
That's what I wanted to make sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative O'Brien.
Thank you. If I could follow up real quickly on a question of Representative Rogers. Did you say you weren't sure if in this case the information was sent to the districts for feedback from parents?
No, what I said was I wasn't sure if we did a PR announcement that would be out in the press. I do know that the districts received information regularly and often.
And probably just an important note, I know districts have so many responsibilities, and as good as they and their PTOs are, sometimes information doesn't get to parents. As a parent of two soon-to-be seniors, I can tell you it wasn't until I got in the legislature I ever heard about this. And I imagine there's people who are much busier than I am. Now, when we're looking at the test, I appreciate the fact that you're trying to really incorporate technology, and some of my concerns, Mr. Chair, might seem a little bit off mark, so I apologize. But I'm very concerned with us moving away from handwriting. When my children received driver's licenses, I had to have them practice their signature 100 times because I did not know how to write their name in cursive. So I do have some concerns as we're pushing more and more technology. I've been writing notes, and sometimes we lose power and we can't use technology. I wonder, how are we going to be adapting for that?
Once again, that's a local decision, and I have to tell you that I had the same reaction when that same grandson of mine came home, and I said, "Oh, this is the year you learn to do cursive," and he said, "Yes, we have to learn how to sign our name." I went, "Oh, okay." And the decision at the local level was that, indeed, they'll be using these, and they will not be taking notes as you and I were trained to take notes. And so locally, districts are making decisions and because of what is in the future of the students.
Well, if tests are driven through technology, it's going to be a natural conclusion that handwriting is going to go the way. And I've been working with my children individually because when filling out job applications, having legible handwriting is a huge issue. Mm-hmm. So as we say we want people to be career ready, I don't know if there's a way that the state school board and the superintendent and Department of Education's office can look at that, because if you can't fill out a job application, which I don't traditionally give to you to type, especially for 16 and 17-year-olds, you're not going to get a job if they can't read it. To move into what's actually collected when you're taking these different tests, what demographic data is actually collected on each student?
We have a variety of variables such as race, ethnicity, male, female, not the full breadth of socioeconomic, but like if they're eligible for free and reduced lunch, if they're eligible for special education services or English language learner services, things like that.
So who gets to pick these categories?
The categories are described by the federal.
I mean, of who gets to pick what choice in the category?
Parents and teachers.
On the tests? I've never been asked to fill out my child's face of the test.
Excuse me, are you talking about what data gets asked?
When they're taking their whatever test it is, it's my understanding there are certain basic demographic data that is collected at that time of the test, and I've never sat with my child to take the test.
It's based on the student enrollment information. So when students are enrolled and parents participate in that process, they fill out that information that's housed with CEPI and our Michigan student database system.
And so if a parent refuses to fill out a category, is that an allowable choice?
We don't have that information then.
Because and so it sounds like then it's very stagnant then. Because socioeconomic status changes by the year, and my school never collects socioeconomic status from me. They might if my child were to fill out a free and reduced application, but we don't fill one out.
There is a process annually where schools can update that information. CEPI would be the right organization to provide exact information on the timing throughout the school year and the mechanism for that.
Just concerned when there's been a lot of conversation, Mr. Chair, about trying to look at growth of students across socioeconomic status, concern that how relevant it really is, B, how timely it is, and C, if it really matters.
All right. Thank you. I'd like to wrap this up by 11:30. We have two more questions. Representative Lipton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you very much. I'm very encouraged by the commitment to privacy and whatnot. You did cite FERPA and obviously all of the initiatives being fully in alignment with FERPA. You are aware of the amendments to FERPA in 2008 and 2011, and I quote that the 2008 amendments to FERPA expanded the definition of, quote, school officials who have access to student data to include, quote, contractors, consultants, volunteers, and other parties to whom an educational agency or institution has outsourced institutional services or functions it would otherwise use employees to perform. This particular attorney concludes, this is not my conclusion, I'm just stating their conclusion, they believe that the change has the effect of increasing the market for student data. So when you made that statement, you are aware of those amendments to FERPA? Okay. The 2011 amendments allow the release of student records for non-academic purposes, and the change, 2011 amendments to FERPA also promote the public use of student IDs that enable access to private educational records. Are you aware of the 2011 amendments as well?
I think the issue is that the lack of connectivity.
Just asking a question.
Yes.
You're aware of those. Okay, thank you. Are you aware of the lawsuit that the group EPIC, are you familiar with EPIC? It's the Electronic Privacy Information Center out of Washington, D.C., sort of a nonprofit watchdog group. Are you aware of the lawsuit that they filed against the U.S. Department of Education, claiming that the department lacked the statutory authority to amend FERPA? No? Okay. All right. I can give you the site if you're interested, perhaps. It was joined by a number of national groups, including the American Civil Liberties Union, the Privacy Rights Clearinghouse, the Center on Law and Information Policy at Fordham University Law School, the World Privacy Forum, so on and so forth. Okay. Are you aware of the class action lawsuit that has been filed on behalf of the parents of the state of New York? On behalf of the transfer of information from the New York Department of Education to the joint venture between Rupert Murdoch and Bill Gates, known as In Bloom, for the purpose of, you're not aware of that? Okay, I can provide you the site for that as well. So it sounds, however, because you're very concerned about privacy, that perhaps legislative action that would ensure that the mistakes of New York are not followed by the state of Michigan. It sounds like you would certainly be in favor of that.
Right, and you know, nothing changes in that regard.
Thank
with
you.
With this new system, nothing changes. That doesn't mean it can't be improved as you may see fit.
Absolutely.
And I'm trying to stay on top of the daily lawsuit against me.
All right.
So that's my main goal.
Our last question. Wrap it up with Representative Verheulen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to be very brief. Just a couple of quick questions. Just does a local district have the flexibility to teach to a different standard? That is, even though the state board has adopted Common Core, could a local district, hypothetically, may not be prudent, may not be wise, but could they teach to the pre-Common Core standard?
They could teach to anything that they choose to teach to locally. That's a local decision totally. I think if you look into the Common Core state standards, for instance, a very popular topic in elementary school is dinosaurs. And you won't find that anywhere in the standards. And almost every school somewhere along the line teaches to that.
So there is no regulatory or financial incentive if a local district hypothetically simply said, we don't like the Common Core standards, we prefer the old standard, or we hypothetically prefer to do our own standard and teach to it. There's no financial or regulatory sanction or penalty that they would pay?
That's correct. And not only that, but let's face it, we have 100 and some thousand teachers every day that often close their door, and one hopes and believes that most of them understand the merit of trying to align these things. And then one of them, I'm going to repeat myself from earlier, but what I found as a superintendent years ago is second grade teachers weren't even talking to third grade teachers. So you weren't really teaching it in a way that you're preparing kids for the next grade. So I have a high confidence level that teachers are doing this for their own good and their understanding of what's best for the kids.
Yeah, but my question kind of goes to, and I go by default to local control.
Yeah.
And as I've been talking
no
to
penalty.
Board members and superintendents in my district, they're local control, and if they have the total flexibility to follow what I'd almost call it a recommendation by the state board, and there may be a penalty in the sense that if they're not teaching to the standard and they're still taking the test, their students may not perform as well on those tests, but they're not compelled to follow that. And then my final question, non-public and homeschoolers, same thing would be true. They can follow Common Core, they can follow the standard pre-Common Core, or they could follow a standard of their own choosing?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and I want to thank you all for your time, your testimony, and your patience today. We'll adjourn till the next meeting, July 31st at 10 o'clock. Thank you.